So despite the name Philly cheesesteak, the steak is probably the least important part. Well, sort of. I just mean that you can make a great cheesesteak using a lot of different cuts of beef. There's not necessarily one correct choice. But for us trying to replicate a restaurant cheesesteak at home, none of that matters unless we can get one other thing right first. Which is why I'm here at Park to Shop. Now what's Park to Shop, you may ask? It's my local Asian grocery store. And the reason I went there was number one, to get these finger-licking pork flavored chips. But maybe more importantly, I went to get this, pre-sliced beef. Because the thing I was talking about earlier that's essential to making a proper cheesesteak at home is to start with very thinly sliced beef. And some of the few places that typically sell it like this pre-packaged are Asian grocery stores. Because it's traditionally used in a dish called hot pot, where basically the beef needs to be cut thin enough that it can be cooked all the way through just by being submerged into a hot pot of broth. Now this one actually doesn't say what cut it is, it just says beef meat. It does look quite fatty though, and after some further research, I'm pretty sure that it's brisket. And I actually did some preliminary testing with it and found that it is quite fatty. I mean, this stuff is like the bacon of beef. It tastes really good, but it makes for a very heavy sandwich. So I went to a different Asian grocery store, and in addition to this same brisket, they also had this, beef knuckle, which sounds kind of weird. I had never heard of it, but again, after some more research, apparently it's part of the sirloin. It's also known as sirloin tip, but just looking at it, you can tell it's quite a bit leaner and definitely a lot closer to what we're looking for. I was also hoping to find some ribeye though, which unfortunately they didn't have. So next I went to my local meat market and just asked the butcher if he could slice some ribeye for me. And to my surprise, he said, yeah, sure, buddy. I don't remember exactly what he said, but I didn't think it'd be that easy. A lot of people online were saying you need to tell him in advance so they could freeze the meat and then slice it, but the guy I talked to said that wasn't necessary. And I mean, looks pretty good to me. So in addition to this ribeye, I also got some sirloin and some strip steak, which I'm gonna compare side by side with my beef knuckle. And the next most important factor is the actual cooking method you use, because another signature feature of the Philly cheesesteak is the unique flavor and texture you get from chopping up the meat on a griddle. Which is why when I went to the Asian grocery store, I got these for a grand total of $6. And I'll show you how I use these in a minute, but first we need to talk about the actual cooking surface, because nearly any restaurant that makes cheesesteaks is gonna be cooking them on a flat top griddle. And I think the best way to simulate that at home is to use carbon steel. Better yet, if you can, a carbon steel griddle, like this one that I got from today's sponsor, Made In. Made In designs professional quality products for the home cook. I've personally tried their stainless steel, enameled cast iron, and carbon steel cookware, all of which I love, but I think their carbon steel line is perfect for making cheesesteaks. Number one, because carbon steel is durable enough to hold up to some abuse, like the chopping that we need to do on the griddle here. But number two, it holds onto heat super well, so we can achieve a really nice sear on the meat. But it's still responsive enough that we can then lower the heat when we need to avoid overcooking it, which is something that can't be said for cast iron. So all of Made In's carbon steel cookware is great for cheesesteaks, but my favorite is actually their carbon steel griddle. One of my favorite things about it is that since it spans 2 burners, I can create different heat zones on the griddle. So for example, with these cheesesteaks, I'll get the onions started over low heat on one side, then I'll cook the meat over high heat on the other side. Then at the end I'll combine them together, because I think cooking the onions together with the beef is important to achieving that authentic taste. But this griddle is also great for making pancakes, eggs, searing any type of meat, and when paired with Made In's stainless steel grill press, there's really no better way to make a smash burger. So to shop Made In's carbon steel cookware, you can use my link in the description below for 10% off your purchase of $100 or more. So thanks again to Made In for sponsoring this video, and thank you for your support. Alright, so I've got my 4 different beefs here. Beef-eye? Beefs? Beef-eye? Okay, I've got my 4 different beefs. And for this taste test here, I'm gonna try each one on its own and in the form of a sandwich. Now to make these, like I said, I cooked the beef over high heat to start in order to get that really nice sear, which is actually something that I noticed a lot of places in Philly don't do. I think because they cook so much meat on the griddle at one time, they don't get quite as nice of a sear. So I think this is something we can do that'll actually give us a better result than some of the best spots in Philly. Or should I say, some of the best Johns in Philly. Now you'll notice I'm not salting the meat here because I actually salted it in advance about 18 hours ago, and then I just left it in my fridge overnight. Now I have a whole video about salting in advance, but basically in addition to seasoning the meat better, it also makes it a little bit more tender and protects against overcooking, which I think will be super important here. Now once the meat develops a nice sear on the first side, I'll just take my spatula and toss it around a bit, and then I'll start chopping. Now a lot of the actual cheesesteak spots that chop their meat on the griddle, like DALESSANDRO'S for example, do it like this. But I found that even with this large griddle, that method is kind of messy since it causes causes the meat and rendered fat to fly all over the place. So instead, I'm using a method that I learned from Steven over at Not Another Cooking Show on YouTube. So he uses a long spatula along with a paint scraper type utensil, like this one I got at the Asian grocery store for $2. So we'll sort of use the spatula to stabilize the meat, and then we'll use the scraper to chop down on it like so. And for me, I'm not going too fine on the chop. I'm aiming for something like what they make at Angelo's in Philly. Now I'll quickly turn the heat down to low, and because this is a comparison and I wanted everything to be cooked exactly the same, I already pre-cooked the onions here. So I just added them to the meat, mixed them in a little bit, and then topped it with cheese. Now I'm still testing out different cheeses, which will be a whole other episode in the future, but here I'm just using American because that was my favorite when I went to Philly. Then I'll top it with my tiny roll, and then carefully try to flip it out onto my plate and form it into a sandwich. It's a little bit harder with these smaller rolls, but I wanted to cut all these pieces from the same roll, so this is just what I'm working with. And by the way, I'm doing this all as a blind taste test to eliminate any bias. So right now, I don't know which is which. Hey Google, is sirloin more tender than ribeye?
On the website, my Chicago Steak.
These rolls, by the way, are coming along nicely. Still a work in progress, but in the next episode, we're gonna be talking about exactly how to make these. But actually, if you're part of my newsletter, you already have access to the full recipe. And if you're not, you can join it using the link in the description below. But regarding the task at hand, there's definitely a clear winner here, and there's definitely a clear loser. The loser to me was this one. Reason being, it's a little too fatty, and it was definitely tougher than the rest. Part of that might be it was the most overcooked. It kind of fried in its own fat, so it got a little bit darker, but even if that weren't the case, it just makes for too heavy of a sandwich for me by the time you got the cheese on there. Between these two here, I honestly couldn't tell a huge difference. I think this one here is a little bit fattier, and so if I had to choose between the two, I would pick this one, but either of these could be decent options. The winner though was definitely this one. It seems maybe the leanest out of all these, but more importantly, it was definitely the most tender. And again, I cooked all these the same way, so let's see which one is which, and maybe we can figure out why we got the results that we did. I think I know which one this one is. Yep, so that's the ribeye. New York strip, that's what I thought as well. Seems a little bit fattier. I'm guessing that this one is a sirloin. Yep, sirloin. Which means that this one is actually the beef knuckle, which is very interesting that it was the most tender. And honestly, I do have a theory for why that is. I think it all comes down to the fact that it was cut the best. You see, my butcher cuts, when I first looked at them, they looked okay. I noticed that there were also some pretty thick cuts in there, mixed in with those thinner cuts. And so just with that inconsistency, some of the parts are gonna overcook, some are gonna undercook. With this knuckle though, that I got at the Asian grocery store, every piece was perfectly uniform, and it was super thin, probably thinner than even the thinnest slices that I got from the butcher, which surprisingly didn't lead to overcooking. It just led to more even cooking, and obviously, as you can see, a better result. With that said, I think any of these cuts are passable. If you do like a heavier sandwich, you could go for the ribeye. Personally, I'd probably recommend sirloin, or if you can find it like this, knuckle. I don't think there's anything inherently better about the knuckle as opposed to say the sirloin. I think it all just comes down to the way it's cut. But for those of you that might not be able to find a good cut at your local Asian grocery store or anywhere else, I want to come up with another method. So the most obvious solution is just to slice it by hand. But in order for this to work, you do need to freeze the meat first. You don't want it completely frozen because then it'll be impossible to cut, but you also don't want it too thawed because then you won't be able to slice it thin enough. In this case, I took this meat out of my freezer about 12 hours ago and it seems pretty good. If you're starting from thawed though, you could throw it in your freezer for about 1 to 2 hours and that should do the trick. So if you have a sharp enough knife and a bit of patience, it seems to work pretty well. But there is actually another solution, because when I was watching that Not Another Cooking Show video that I mentioned earlier, Steven actually used a mandolin. Now for me, I kind of swore off of using a mandolin a few years ago after I cut myself pretty bad on one. Wow. Yeah, that works really well. You just have to make sure you press down hard enough so it slices all the way through, but that's definitely the best method. It's super quick, super easy, and a lot better results than cutting by hand. I'm honestly kind of torn on whether I'll just do it this way or if I'll continue buying it from the Asian grocery store. But even more important than the beef that you use is the rolls, at least in my opinion. So you can check out this video right here to see the last episode where I tried to make the best cheesesteak rolls on the internet. And you can check out the next episode of this series right here once it's uploaded. So thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.